Hello, everyone. Have you ever knelt in the dark, your heart a raw, open wound, and hurled a prayer into the heavens with the last ounce of your strength? You plead, you bargain, you weep, and in return, silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, it feels like a judgment. It's a silence that hollows you out, that makes the pillars of your faith tremble and crack. We've all been there. We've all felt that. But what if I told you that silence isn't empty? What if it isn't an absence, but a presence? What if something is standing between you and the divine, intercepting your prayers, feeding on your despair, and twisting your intentions? What if the reason your prayers go unanswered has nothing to do with God's hearing, and everything to do with three deadly mistakes you might be making? Right now, without even realizing it, we are about to embark on a journey. This is the story of a man named Kael, and his story might just be your own. The sun was a merciless hammer over the valley of Adar. It beat down on the cracked earth, turning the riverbed into a mosaic of dried mud and bleached stones. For 3 seasons, not a single drop of rain had fallen. The fields, once green and generous, were now skeletal remains, their crops turned to dust that danced in the hot, dry wind. Kael, a stonemason whose hands were more accustomed to shaping rock than pleading with the sky, felt the despair of his people like a physical weight on his shoulders. He was a righteous man. He followed the laws, he gave his tithes. His prayers were a constant murmur in his life, as familiar as the rhythm of his own breathing. But now his prayers were met with that same merciless, silent sky. Every morning he climbed every evening he returned with the dust of failure on his sandals and the taste of ash in his mouth. His daughter Leah grew thinner each day, her eyes large and questioning in her small face. His wife Sarah tried to remain strong, but he saw the hope draining from her like water from a cracked cistern. The village elder, a man named Baruch, with a beard as white as salt and a heart as hard as granite, "Your God is deaf, stonemason," Baruch would say, his voice laced with scorn. Or perhaps he is sleeping, or perhaps he has simply forgotten us. The words were like stones thrown at his soul. Kael's faith, once a mighty fortress, was being weathered away, one silent day at a time. He had prayed for his crops. They withered. He had prayed for the sick child in the neighboring hut. The child died. He had prayed for a sign, any sign at all, that he was still heard. The heavens remained a blank, unforgiving canvas of blue. This wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was an annihilation of the self. If his prayers were nothing, what was he? If his connection to the divine was severed, what was the point of his righteousness? One night, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer, Kael made a decision. He would go to the one place the elders had forbidden. The altar of the forsaken, high in the jagged peaks, a place where it was said the veil between worlds was thin, where ancient and forgotten powers still lingered. It was a place of madness and desperation. It was his last hope, as he stole away from his home under the cold light of a slivered moon. He didn't see the shadow that detached itself from the corner of his house. The silence was its domain, and Kael's despair was the feast it had long been anticipating. The climb was brutal. The path was a treacherous memory, overgrown with thorny vines that tore at his skin and clothes. The wind howled through the peaks, whispering names he didn't know, carrying sounds that were almost words, almost pleas. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear, but the greatest fear was the one that drove him onward, the fear of returning to that suffocating silence. He finally reached the summit. The altar of the forsaken was a single massive slab of obsidian, pulsing with a faint, cold light under the moon. It felt ancient, humming with a power that was neither holy nor unholy, but simply primal. This was not a place of gentle worship. This was a place of raw transaction, a place where desperate souls came to scream into the abyss and hope something screamed back. Kael fell to his knees before the stone, the sharp rocks digging into his flesh. He didn't have the words for a formal prayer. All he had was the raw, unfiltered agony of his soul. "Hear me," he cried, his voice raw and broken. "I have been faithful. Why do you let my child starve? Give me rain, give me a sign, give me anything." He slammed his fists against the cold obsidian, the impact jarring his bones. He poured out all his grief, all his anger, all his confusion, until he was an empty vessel, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air, and then the world shifted. The The change was not sudden, but insidious. The moonlight seemed to congeal. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and old regrets. The stars above him began to blur, their light swallowed by an encroaching darkness. Kael looked down at his hands, and they were no longer his own. They were gaunt, skeletal, the hands of a starving man. He scrambled backward, a cry catching in his throat. The landscape around him was transforming. The jagged peaks dissolved into a suffocating, claustrophobic version of his own village. But everything was wrong. The houses were hunched and twisted, their windows like vacant, weeping eyes. The dust was not dust, but a thick gray ash that choked him. And the silence was gone. It had been replaced by a chorus of whispers. They slithered around him, coiling in his ears, speaking his deepest, most secret fears aloud. She's hungry. Kael, Leah is so hungry. Sarah has lost all hope in you. She sees only a failure. Baruch was right. Your God is sleeping. He has forgotten you. He saw a vision of his daughter, her face pale and sunken, reaching for him with a withered hand, her voice a dry rasp. Father, why won't you save me? Leah, he screamed, trying to run to her, but his feet were stuck in the ashen ground as if it were quicksand. He was trapped in a living nightmare, a world constructed from the architecture of his own terror. This was his first mistake. A voice smooth as polished obsidian and cold as the grave echoed not in his ears but directly in his mind. You pray from a pit of fear, stonemason. You do not offer faith, you offer panic. Your desperation is a stench that pollutes your words. You think you are calling for a savior, but all you are doing is screaming, I do not believe. Your fear is the ink, your terror is the parchment. You have written a prayer that God cannot, or will not, read. Kael spun around, trying to find the source of the voice. The world warped and twisted around him. He saw the villagers, their faces contorted with hatred, pointing at him. Baruch's voice boomed, amplified by the nightmare. His piety is a sham. He has brought this drought upon us. They began to advance, their hands reaching for him, their eyes burning with accusation. He was utterly alone, drowning in the abyss of his own anxieties. Help me, he shrieked, his prayer now just a raw animal cry of terror. The voice in his head chuckled, a sound like grinding stone. You see, you ask for help, but you expect damnation. You plead for a miracle, but you are already convinced of your doom. This world, you see, this is the world your prayers have built. I am merely the architect. Every desperate plea you make is another brick in your prison. You are not praying for rescue, Kael. You are praying for this nightmare to be real. This was the first deadly trap, the first mistake. It wasn't a petition. It was a surrender to the very darkness he sought to escape. His terror gave the shadow substance. His panic gave it power. He was feeding the very entity that was tormenting him. The more he begged for the nightmare to end, the more vivid it became. The accusing faces of the villagers drew closer, their whispers turning into a roar. His daughter's ghostly image faded. He was trapped, not by chains or walls, but by the very nature of his corrupted prayer. The world of ash and accusation pressed in, suffocating him. The whispers became a deafening roar of his own inadequacies. He was drowning. He closed his eyes, expecting to be torn apart by the phantoms his fear had given life. But in that moment of absolute surrender to despair, a memory it was small, simple, and pure. It was the memory of Leah a year ago before the drought. She was sitting on his lap as he carved a small wooden bird. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just there, her head resting on his chest, her small hand on his, her trust in him absolute and unconditional. It was a moment of pure, selfless love. There was no fear in that memory, no desperation, It was a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness, a single note of truth in a symphony of lies. He stopped screaming for help. He stopped pleading for escape. He focused all of his being on that one memory, that one feeling of love for his daughter. He didn't pray with words, he prayed with the memory itself, a pure, selfless offering, a wave of force, silent and powerful, emanated from him. The accusatory faces of the villagers flickered and dissolved. The choking ash thinned, and the suffocating pressure lessened. The voice in his head hissed, surprised and angered. What is this? This is not a prayer of fear. Kael opened his eyes. The nightmare had not vanished, but it had lost its grip on him. He was still in the twisted version of his village, but it now seemed flimsy, and standing before him where the mob had been was a figure. It was not solid. It was a column of shifting shadows, a distortion in the air that was darker than the surrounding gloom. It had no face, yet he could feel its ancient, malevolent intelligence focused entirely on him. "You are clever, stonemason, the shadow." Thing spoke, its voice now audible in the air, a chilling whisper that seemed to steal the warmth. "You found a loophole, a prayer without want, but it changes nothing. You are still in my domain. You still desire something. You still want the rain." This was Malachor, the whisperer, the shadow of doubt, an ancient entity that fed on the corrupted prayers of mortals, a parasite of faith. "I do want the rain," Kael said, his voice trembling but steady. He would not show fear. He had learned that lesson. Malachor seemed to smile, though it had no mouth. The shadows swirled, forming a pleasing, almost human shape. "Of course you do. Your motive is noble, or so you tell yourself." The nightmare world dissolved completely, replaced by a stunning vision. The valley of Adar was lush and green, overflowing with abundance. A gentle, life-giving rain was falling. The villagers were dancing, singing, celebrating. They lifted Kael onto their shoulders, hailing him as their savior. "Kael the prophet," they chanted. "Kael the God-favored." He saw Baruch bowing before him, his face filled with awe and repentance. He saw Sarah looking at him with adoration, her pride in him shining in her eyes. He saw Leah, healthy and happy, telling everyone, "My father brought the rain." The vision was intoxicating. It was everything he had secretly dreamed. "This can be yours," Malachor whispered, its voice now seductive, persuasive. "I can give you this. The rain, the adoration, the legacy, all of it. All I ask is that you admit the truth, admit why you truly want it." "This isn't just about saving your people, is it, Kael? Be honest, it's about saving yourself. It's about proving Baruch wrong. It's about being the hero. It's about the glory." The whisperer's words were sharp, and they struck a deep hidden nerve. He had told himself his prayers were selfless. But were they? In the deepest, most secret corners of his heart, hadn't he yearned for this? To be the one who saved them? To have his faith validated not just for God, but for all to see. To silence the mockers and earn the praise of his wife and the worship of his child, Malachor pressed its advantage. Ambition is the engine of man. Even piety can be a form of pride. You want to be remembered. You want your name carved into the history of your people, not just into the stones of their houses. Admit it, pray for that. Pray for the glory you deserve, and I will give you the rain as your reward. Your prayer will be answered instantly. This was the second, more subtle, and far more deadly mistake. Praying with an impure it's a prayer for self, disguised as a prayer for others. It is asking God to serve your ambition, to be a co-signer on your vanity. Kael felt a profound, sickening wave of self-realization. Malachor was right. A part of him, a dark and hungry part, wanted the glory. It was a poison that had tainted every prayer he had sent to the heavens. He had been asking for rain, but he had been demanding validation. He had been pleading for his people, but he had been seeking a pedestal. Malachor's offer was a perfect trap. To accept it would be to get what he wanted, but to lose his soul in the process. He would have his miracle, but it would be a miracle from the wrong source, granted for the wrong reason. His answered prayer would be his damnation. The vision of his own triumph became grotesque to him. The cheering faces seemed to mock him. He saw the truth. A prayer answered by a demon is no blessing. He looked at the shifting shadow of Malachor, the tempter, the mirror to his own hidden darkness, and for the first time he saw it not as a monster to be feared, but as a liar to be defied. "No," Kael said, his voice quiet, but resonant with newfound power. The vision of his glory flickered. "What did you say?" Malachor hissed, the pleasing form dissolving back into a chaotic whirl of shadow. "My prayers were tainted," Kael admitted, "not to the shadow, but to himself, to the universe. You have shown me that. There was pride in my heart, there was a desire for glory, but I will not trade my soul for a field of green crops. I will not ask a thing of darkness to satisfy the vanity of my heart. If my people are to be saved, it will be by a clean hand and a pure prayer. I reject your offer." He turned his back on the vision. He turned his back on the temptation. He chose integrity in the face of desolation. He chose a clean conscience over a full belly. It was an act of profound spiritual courage. He expected the shadow to lash out to punish him for his defiance. But instead, a strange thing happened. The darkness it exuded became less potent. The chilling cold in the air began to recede. It was as if the shadow's very substance was woven from his own moral compromises, and by refusing to compromise he was unraveling it. "Fool!" Malachor shrieked, its voice losing its confident, seductive tone and becoming thin and reedy. "You choose starvation over glory. You choose righteousness over results. You will die in that desert, and your pure heart will be food for vultures." But its threats were hollow. Its power over him was broken. Kael had faced the darkness outside by conquering the darkness within. He had passed the second test. He had avoided the second deadly mistake, and in the space created by his renunciation, in the vacuum left by the receding shadow, a new presence entered. It was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the non-world they occupied. It was not darkness. It was a light so brilliant, so absolute it was painful to behold, a light that was not the opposite of dark, but the origin of reality itself, a light that cast no shadows because it was everywhere at once. Malachor let out a sound that was half a scream and half a sigh of dissolution, and it evaporated like smoke in a hurricane. Kael fell to his knees, shielding his eyes, his entire being vibrating with the sheer power that now filled the space. He felt infinitesimally small, a speck of dust in the presence of a star. A figure began to coalesce within the light. It was tall, terrifying, and beautiful in a way that defied mortal comprehension. It had 6 wings, not of feather, but of pure, living light, and its face was a constantly... Its eyes were burning wheels of sapphire, and they saw not just Kael, but the entire history and future of his soul. This was no gentle, cherubic messenger. This was a warrior, a prince of heaven, an entity of terrifying and majestic power. Kael, son of Adam, a voice boomed. Not with sound, but with a pressure that resonated directly in his bones. In his very DNA, you have withstood the... Now you face the final test. This was Zuriel, the angel of the unseen path, a guardian of divine will. His presence was not comforting, it was demanding. It demanded truth. It demanded surrender. "My lord," Kael stammered, his face pressed to the ground, which was now no longer ash or obsidian, but a floor of shimmering crystal. I don't understand," I prayed. "I tried to pray with... Why was I abandoned to that thing?" Zuriel's gaze was unyielding. "We did not abandon you, we watched you. The silence you perceived was not an absence of hearing, but a test of your heart. A prayer is not a transaction. It is not a coin you put in a celestial machine to receive a miracle. It is a declaration of your allegiance. We needed to know who you were praying to and why. The whisperer can only intercept a prayer that is already addressed to him. A prayer of fear, a prayer of pride, a prayer of self." Kael's mind reeled. The divine silence wasn't a punishment. It was a quarantine. It was a holy space designed to let the impurities of his own soul rise to the surface so he could see them, confront them, and cleanse them. "But my people are starving," Kael pleaded, lifting his head, "and that," Zuriel's voice thundered, "is your third and final mistake." The angel raised a hand of pure light, and the crystalline floor beneath Kael became a window. He looked down and saw his valley. Adar he saw it not as it was now, but as it would be in one full cycle of the moon. He saw his people, his family, still struggling but alive. And then he saw the earth begin to tremble. He saw he saw the mountain, the very one he had climbed, collapse in a terrible world, shattering landslide, burying the entire valley, the skeletal fields, the village, his own home, under 1,000,000 tons of rock and earth. An earthquake. A cataclysm that would have left no survivors. Kael stared in horror, his breath catching in his throat. If it had rained, his people would have stayed. They would have celebrated their salvation, and they would have all been buried alive. The drought, the famine, it was not a curse. It was a crucible. It was a terrible, painful, agonizing mercy. It was a divine impetus to force them to leave a place that was already condemned. God was not ignoring his prayer for rain. He was answering a deeper prayer Kael didn't even know he had prayed. The prayer for the survival of his people. It was a harsh and terrible exodus. "You pray for what you want," Zuriel stated, the vision fading, God provides what you need. You see a parched field, he sees a collapsing mountain. You ask for comfort, he offers you strength. You plead for a change in your circumstances, he works to change your character. Your third mistake, Kael, is the mistake of all mortals. You presume to know the solution. You try to dictate the terms. You pray with a map of your own making and ask God to follow it. But his map is older and sees all the roads, all the dangers you cannot yet perceive. This was the final devastating truth, the ultimate reason for unanswered prayers. It wasn't about the right words or the right posture. It was about surrendering the outcome. It was about trusting that the divine architect had a better blueprint. It was the shift from saying, "Give me to pray, your will be done," is to admit that you do not know best. It is to hand over the reins. It is the ultimate act of faith. Not faith that you will get what you want, but faith that what you get will be what you need. Kael finally understood the silence, the nightmare, the temptation. It had all been a refining fire. It had burned away his fear, his pride, and finally his stubborn insistence on his own limited solution. He was left with nothing but the raw, naked core of his faith. He looked up at the terrifying, beautiful face of the angel, and there was no fear left in him, only a profound, shattering sense of peace. He knelt there, not as a beggar demanding alms, but as a son trusting his father. He spoke his final prayer. It was not a desperate plea. It was not a transactional bargain. It was a simple, "Not my will," he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the celestial space. "But yours be done," as he spoke the words. The brilliant light of Zuriel's being softened, the angel's fiery eyes seemed to hold a flicker of approval, of communion. The connection that had been blocked was now open, flowing like a river. There was no need for more visions, no need for more tests. The lesson was learned, the transformation. Go, your path is now clear. You came seeking rain, but you will leave with a revelation. You will not be the hero who brings a miracle. You will be the leader who brings the truth. This will be a harder task. Many will doubt you, Baruch will call you a madman, but you will not be guided by their praise or their scorn. You will be guided by the unseen path. Go lead your people out of the valley of death. The light faded, the crystalline Kael found himself back on the cold mountain summit, kneeling before the obsidian altar. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of orange and violet. The night was over. He was no longer the same man who had climbed the mountain. The desperation was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. He carried no magical promise of rain, no vial of holy water. He carried something far more powerful. He walked back down the mountain, his steps sure and steady. When he entered the village, the people gathered, their faces etched with hunger and wary hope. They saw the change in him. It was in his eyes, in the way he held himself. Baruch stepped forward, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Well, stonemason, did your sleeping god finally wake up? Where is the rain you promised?" Kael looked at the elder, and "There will be no rain," Kael said, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the silent crowd. "But we are saved. A great doom is coming to this valley. We must leave. We must journey east toward the rising sun. A new home awaits us there." A murmur of disbelief and anger went through the crowd. "Leave? Baruch spat? Leave our homes, our lands? Based on what? A dream you had on a cursed mountain." "It was not a dream," Kael replied simply. He didn't try to explain the angel, the shadow, the visions. They would not understand. Instead, he spoke of what he knew in his bones, with a conviction that was more powerful than any proof. He spoke of the path ahead, of the hardship, but also of the necessity. He painted a picture not of an easy miracle, but of a difficult, life-affirming journey. Some scoffed and turned away, choosing the familiar comfort of their dying homes over the terrifying uncertainty of the unknown. But many, including his wife Sarah, who saw the undeniable truth in his eyes, and others who were tired of waiting for a sign from the sky, chose to believe. They chose to follow the man who had gone into the darkness, and returned with a light in his eyes. The story of Kael ends not with a miraculous cloudburst, but with a line of weary figures walking away from their homes, leaving the valley of Adar behind. They walked toward an uncertain future, led by a man who learned that the most powerful prayers are not those that change God's mind, but those that allow God to change ours. His journey reveals the three deadly mistakes that create a barrier between us and the divine. The second is praying with the impure motive of pride and self-glorification, which invites the whispers of darkness. And the third, most profound mistake is trying to impose our own will, our own solutions, believing our limited sight sees the whole picture. True prayer is the antidote. It is a prayer of faith, not fear, a prayer of humility, not pride, and ultimately, it is the understanding that sometimes the most loving answer God can give us is no to the thing we are asking for in order to give us a resounding yes to the thing our soul truly needs. That is all for today's video. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that silence and wondered why, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us continue to explore the